on access to education for undocumented and precarious status residents in cities. We are being hosted by Ryerson University in Toronto, and we want to start our session today by acknowledging the unique connections and relationships Indigenous persons and their ancestors have had with the land for thousands of years. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So we start with that land acknowledgement today to reflect on throughout our conversations. My name is Dr. Rachel Humphreys from Queen Mary University of London, and I'm the co-organizer of this event with Dr. Graham Hudson from Ryerson University in Toronto. We have 6 interrelated but standalone forums that have made up the Sanctuary What Next series. They all have addressed different aspects of the pioneering work being done in cities by, with, and for undocumented and precarious status residents. All the sessions have been recorded and are available on YouTube, and we will make all the links available for you. We'll tweet them and put them in the chats. And thanks to the incredible work of the media team, all of those links are now available. So we can do that immediately. Resource sheets are also available for each session with links to deepen our understanding of these issues and campaigns, and to inspire us in our continuing work on these issues. Some brief housekeeping before we begin. So please post your questions in the Q&A function. Please state if the question is directed at a particular speaker or to the panel in general. That would be really helpful. Please also post any materials that you or your organization have produced on these issues, because we're creating that repository and those resource lists. And so we'll collate all of those and share them, as you, like us, are here to learn and to network with each other to continue in these struggles. I just want to add very briefly that this is our last event, and it's been a huge privilege and a pleasure to organize these sessions. We've been absolutely overwhelmed with the response. We had more than 1,500 people registered for these events. So I draw a lot of hope from that. There are a lot of us out there interested in these issues, and I hope that we can build on this momentum, continue these conversations, be inspired, get angry, and organize together in the future. So on that note, I'll hand over to Graham.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd like to echo the sentiment. It's been a beautiful experience these past 5 and now 6 sessions, and it's very fitting that we're ending with access to education, looking to the future and new generations. Before we get started, I would like to just extend some thanks to all of the institutions and the organizations and people who have helped make all of this possible and enjoyable, no less. So, of course, we'd like to thank the presenters for today and the chairs. Also, we'd like to thank the presenting partners, which include Queen Mary University of London, the University of San Francisco, Ryerson University, Migrants Workers Alliance for Change, No One is Illegal, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. We'd like to thank the Ryerson Faculty of Law Dean, Donna Young, for all of the encouragement and support for this event, and hopefully affiliated ones in the near future. The Faculty of Arts Dean, Pamela Sugerman, who promised to provide some funding and support about a year and a half ago when Rachel and I had thought this would be a three-dimensional conference. Thanks for all of that. We might talk to you again next time around. We'd like to thank the entire planning committee, which was very useful in kind of marshalling all of the different ambitions that Rachel and I had in terms of themes and topics and presenters. It's been really a good experience, and looking forward to continuing this on. And of course, all of the community partners who helped connect us with presenters and inspire and shape our collective works professionally and personally. As Rachel said, we really do have to thank our media services team, Luke and Brian. And of course, then we have our co-chairs today, one of whom is Rachel. I don't think she needs an introduction at this point. The second co-chair is Vernetta Averill. And Vernetta is a West Indian teacher, an activist and ally living in Toronto, Canada. She's a co-chair of the S4 Collective and is currently pursuing degrees in cognitive neuropsychology and education. Vernetta is passionate about social justice issues and seeks to advocate for disenfranchised and marginalized youth, especially around access to education. As a future teacher, an aspiring teacher, she hopes to contribute to equitable learning environments and continue work on decolonizing education. Please take it away.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Rachel. In today's economy, graduating from high school and going on to post-secondary or tertiary education is critical for students to have the greatest professional options and opportunities, such as financial security or a successful career. However, this opportunity is not available to everyone. Nelson Mandela described education as the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world. And I'm very happy that we have this panel assembled here today to help us tackle the barriers that post-secondary students face, especially the ones with precarious immigration status. So to start off, to the panel, when it comes to addressing the exclusion of precarious status students, what types of stories and campaigns have worked or not worked to advance precarious status students in education? We're going to start off with the S4 Collective.
And so I will give the introductions and introduce the S4 Collective. So first we have Tanya Aberman. Tanya has been working to increase access to education for sanctuary students in different capacities for over 5 years. She has developed and coordinated community and university-based access to education programs, working with academic and community stakeholders, while focusing on and prioritizing the experiences and needs of sanctuary students. She has also co-authored several pieces based on the need for increased access to education. Tanya has a bachelor's degree in political science from Concordia University, an MA from the University of Sussex in gender and development, and a PhD in gender, feminist, and women's studies from York University in Toronto. I would just like to add that I had the absolute pleasure of being at the S4 Collective launch last year and had the privilege of learning firsthand the inspiring and incredible work that the S4 Collective are doing. So I'm feeling hugely grateful and honored that you can join us today. And before you speak, Tanya, I would also like to introduce Elizabeth Barrera, also from the S4 Collective. Elizabeth is a Nawa multidisciplinary artist residing in Toronto. With a background in criminology and Indigenous studies, Elizabeth seeks to understand the various intersections that affect newcomer youth who have had to navigate the immigration system. She is also passionate about advocating for a curriculum that will switch the narrative from a Western and colonized view to an Indigenous-based pedagogy. Liz, I think we can all agree that you are doing enormously important work and advocacy. Thank you for being with us today and for sharing your expertise on these issues. And finally, from the S4 Collective, we have Brentella Williams. Brentella is a third-year political science student at York University and an active member of the S4 Collective since its creation. In addition to being a student, she is also a workshop facilitator for the People for Education in partnership with the Students' Commission of Canada. She has also completed numerous Equitas workshops, including Speaking Rights, and hosted numerous virtual workshops with the S4 Collective. Her 4-year-old daughter, Aaliyah, is her constant motivator. Brentella, it's an honor to have you with us today. Thank you for being with us to share your wealth of experience and expertise. And so to address the question, I will leave it up to you, Elizabeth, Brentella, and Tanya to take it away.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Vanetta. And thank you all for joining us today in our discussion about access to education in regards to precarious students. When speaking about campaigns, it is important to note the power of activism. It is because of the tireless and hard-fought work of many advocates that the campaigns of which I will speak about today are even a reality. While there are many campaigns who have worked on the advancements for precarious status students in education, I will discuss three major campaigns, which are the Education Act, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and the S4 Collective. The first, the Education Act, due to activism of migrant justice agencies and advocates, the 1993 Education Act, specifically 49.1, was introduced by the Ministry of Education of Ontario to ensure accessible education to all. The Act states that children under the age of 18, regardless of their status or that of their parents, are not denied access to education. This bill acted in accordance with Canada's 1990 agreement with the UN Convention ensuring the protection of rights of children. However, the idea of inclusivity was challenged as many stories surfaced about the removal of students of precarious status on school grounds in order to detain their parents. The second campaign is the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. I'm sorry, give me one second. It's the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Migrant justice groups gained another victory as the Toronto District School Board ushered in the Students Without Legal Immigration Status policy. This policy, otherwise known as the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, was overwhelmingly passed in 2007. This policy was implemented to provide a safe learning environment for students to access without fear. However, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy stated that students should not have to provide proof of immigration status in order to gain admittance into a learning institution. However, just like its predecessor, this policy was viewed more as a directive rather than a law. There were no enforcements of the act, which led to the open interpretation of educational institutions, many of which still requested proof of status under the guise of data reporting and the issuance of school fees that can range from 8,000 to 14,000 Canadians. Another disadvantage of these two bills is the exclusion of students after high school. The bills only protected the rights of education of children from kindergarten to grade 12. For many precarious students, this is a very difficult time. They are forced to grapple with the new barrier that prevents them from transitioning from high school to post-secondary institution. This isolates a segment of the population of many individuals who have the capacity and eagerness to learn, but are refused access to a learning space because of their precarious status. Which brings us to our third campaign. Out of the many conversations from advocacy groups about immigration status as a barrier and accessible education being a human right for all, the Sanctuary Students Solidarity and Support Collective, otherwise known as S4 Collective, was created. The S4 Collective, which started in 2018, was a member-driven organization created to provide equitable and accessible post-secondary education to all students regardless of their immigration status.
Thank you so much for the lead up, Brentella. So as we have already explained, a lot of the work that S4 does leads to the intersection between high school and post-secondary, because it becomes a very important point for the students with precarious status. There are feelings of uncertainty about not having the access to post-secondary education. Maybe a lot of our members don't really know where they're going to go. And it's that feeling of not having access to maybe your goals, your dreams, that plagues a lot of the feelings of our members. And as a whole collective, we believe that education should be a right. No one should be excluded, especially because of immigration status. We have led various stories and campaigns that advocate for increasing access to education in the Canadian sense. And the beauty about the S4 Collective is that it focuses on the importance of student activists and youth voices. We try to provide the platform for these youth to create their own narratives and have their own agency over their own stories. And one thing that we have tried to actively fight against is the Dreamers narrative that has kind of been adopted by Canada. I know that in the US, it has a different context, but what the Canadian media and what the Canadian stories have been trying to do is that it creates this dichotomy between the good and the bad immigrants, who is deserving of status and who is not deserving of status. And it obviously gets rid of the intersectionality that a lot of people will face depending on gender, race, class, and that might actually hinder their pathways to status. And obviously, in the Canadian term, deserving usually means your proximity to whiteness and how easily you can assimilate to white settler culture. So this is an argument and that S4 just doesn't believe in as a whole idea, as a whole collective, as I have stated in the past. Everyone should have equal access to education, regardless of the intersections that they might face. So what we have done in order to combat this narrative, we have hosted high school nights for people who potentially want to pursue post-secondary, and we have also created a list of resources for them to use in case that maybe a post-secondary institution is not their idea of their future. So there are always other pathways to follow. We have created the zine Metamorphosis, which is a beautifully created compilation of the stories of the youth through poetry, storytelling, images. And I feel like this was a very important point in the collective's history because it provides and it exposes the narratives of the youth with appropriate representation and recognition instead of letting the media or other big picture people kind of paint their narratives. And as I said before, it allows the creation of a platform that empowers the youth to share their own stories and gives them a sense of agency over their narratives and their link with precarious status. So yeah, it has been an awesome thing to work in, and that's a few of our projects so far.
Thank you, S4 Collective, Elizabeth and Brentella. And now we're going to move on to our UK panelists, and we're going to ask them the same questions to get the UK perspective of the types of stories and campaigns that have worked and not worked.
So I will introduce our UK panelists. So first we have Kimberly Garande, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you, Kimberly, from the hugely impressive organisation We Belong, that's based in the UK. Kimberly is the outreach officer at We Belong. She was born in Zimbabwe and migrated to the UK aged 9. She applied for student finance in 2015 and realised that her immigration status would be a barrier to going to university because it meant she wasn't eligible for a student loan. In the same year, Kimberly attended a leadership academy, which provided support and, importantly, awareness that she was not alone. Through family support, Kimberly began her studies at Canterbury Christchurch University, and alongside that, gained work experience as a culturosity facilitator. She promoted youth development through creative learning of equality and diversity principles. Kimberly began her role at We Belong in October 2019, so over a year now, and what a year it's been. I imagine not the year you expected, and is dedicated to changing how current society relates to migrants. She wants sustainable justice for the fates of other young migrants like herself. Kimberly, thank you for joining us today and for the inspiring work that you've been doing for us all here in the UK. And we'll move to you first with that question, and then I will introduce James.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm just going to give you, I guess, an overview of what We Belong does. We are a youth-led charity made up of young migrants, and we really came into conception in 2014 and officially became a charity last year. So we are growing, we are small, but the two main things that have really worked in the two campaigns that I'm going to focus in speaking to you today are our Let Us Learn campaign, which fights for equal access for education for all young migrants. So I'm coming to this issue from the perspective of speaking of all young migrants with precarious status. So the types of stories that have worked, and our main campaign, which started us off, was called Let Us Learn. So this started in 2014, whereby our co-CEOs found out they were unable to go and attend university due to their immigration status. And prior to this, no one had really been working on this issue with regards to young migrants who had been in the UK for a considerable long period of time since a young age. So starting off in 2014 and galvanizing as many young migrants to support this issue came a court case in which we used case studies to support strategic litigation in 2015 for a court case regarding a young girl who was wanting to go to university but wasn't able to go due to her immigration status at the time and barriers to higher education access in the UK. But as a result of that court case and the support that we also provided with our case studies, this meant a law change that then allowed young migrants with precarious status to be able to go to university, but they still had to meet certain criteria. And even till this day, that criteria is really narrow. So we galvanized more young people across the UK to join and share their stories. And the most important thing was the fact that, these young people felt as though they were alone at this time. So that was the really big key thing in this, in us building We Belong to where we're at the moment, is that sense of community and having young people who are affected by policy or, the Home Office and immigration, their access to education was being affected. So we needed to put them at the heart of the organisation and actually equip them with the knowledge and tools to be able to write to their local MPs, to be able to, lobby for more scholarships to their universities. And that's exactly what we did. We wrote to university chancellors all across the UK. We also had physical actions. For example, we had one called Mince Pie Fridays, where we baked mince pies and hand delivered them to university staff with the hope to get a meeting with university chancellors to get them to actually provide scholarships for young migrants with complex status. Because prior to this, if you had complex status, and you weren't eligible for mainstream funding due to the colour of your passport, you weren't able to go at all. And now the criteria was a lot more open, but still narrowed for many young migrants. So we continue to do more work on this, which led us to actually think about the real reason young migrants were in this issue. And that was because of their immigration status. So that leads me to our next campaign, Chasing Status, in which we advocate for shorter, more affordable routes to settlement for all young migrants. And we're working with young migrants the 10-year route to settlement. And again, trying to build in relationships with local MPs, and not only using, the strategic litigation that we've done in the past, it was also important to change the message that was in the media and in the public and in our own selves. I was, as Rachel explained, I'm originally from Zimbabwe. And when I got to the point of going to university as a young migrant with complex status in the UK, it was incredibly difficult to be told at that point that I'd be classified as as overseas. So having that support system within We Belong and other young people who were going through the same situation, but were determined to go to higher levels of authority and also branch off with other organisations to support this issue and raise awareness that it's actually going on, that was really the mould, and that was the most important thing that advanced our campaign. That power of community, strong word of mouth, but not only that, giving young people the information, and not only giving them the information, but then giving them the confidence to be able to do something about their situation themselves. So those are the two main campaigns that we're working on and continue to work on: equal access to higher education and equal and shorter, more affordable routes to settlement with regards to immigration. I hope I've not gone over my 3 minutes. I'm just trying to look at the time. Cut me off if you want to. There's a lot more within those 2 campaigns, but I don't want to talk too much.
Thank you, Kimberly, for sharing your insights into the types of stories and campaigns that have worked. It sounds like you are doing a really great work over in the UK, and we appreciate it and hope that it continues and that we see great results when it comes to equal access to higher education for students. And before we move on to James, that if you could speak to the types of stories and campaigns that have worked, as well as what should education institutions be doing? For example, when it comes to loan schemes or training campus security, peer support, and scholarship to help further the cause.
And so I will introduce James to answer that question. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce James Bletchley-Asra from Citizens UK, who is not only a fiercely committed campaigner, but also I count him as a dear friend and colleague who has helped me really think about these issues in a new way, particularly around what it means to be a sanctuary university in the UK today. James has been a community organiser for 8 years and has pioneered a whole university approach to organising with King's College London, which is a university here in the UK in London, and has co-founded Parent Power and the Citizenship Payment Plan as part of this. James also leads Citizen UK's diaspora organising team that focuses on developing leaders of migrant descent and campaigning on issues that are important to migrant and refugee communities. James, thank you for joining us today, and I can't wait to hear more about these pioneering programmes that you've been spearheading.
Thanks, Rachel. And hi, everyone. It's good to be with you. It's a particularly important issue for me. I'm the child of migrants. My dad actually came here as a young person and wasn't able to go to university. I was undocumented for like 7 or 8 years before he was able to stay. And so I feel very like passionate about these about issues about access to education and the rights of migrants. And I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things I think we've learned in Citizens UK, working with universities on this issue in the last few years. And we're a network of institutions across the country. And the idea is to try and bring people together to try and create change. And what we've, I guess, learned through working with this issue is, first of all, I think what universities perhaps do well is come up with there's lots of ideas and research and thinking through the problems. And I think there's lots of incredible academics. But one of the key insights we've seen is actually universities in the UK, at least, are incredibly powerful institutions. And a lot of the challenges that young people are facing actually don't come from a lack of knowing what needs to be done or having the answers or solutions, but it comes down to a lack of power. And thinking through how universities can essentially share some of the power that they have and the access to resources they have to be able to make systemic change with young people, I think is crucial. And just to give you one lesson from a campaign that hasn't worked yet, although we're still fighting. So we've got a campaign, it's called Children into Citizens. And the idea is we're trying to reduce the barriers that children face in the UK to become citizens. And we worked with the Institute of Education at UCL in London to put students into 12 different schools across London. And we did what's called a listening campaign, try and find out what is it that the barriers are, what are the challenges for young people getting status. And the main thing that came up was the cost of citizenship. In the UK, if you're born in the UK, when you're 10 years old, you can become a citizen, but it's currently £1,012, which is incredibly expensive and prohibitive for a lot of parents, especially if they're not able to work. So the students from UCL did a lot of workshops, training, leadership development with the young people, and we ended up having 200 young people outside the Home Office, which is the main sort of decision maker in this issue. And they wrote poems, they presented them, put them into an anthology and presented them to the minister, asking for a meeting to discuss this. And we've got a meeting with the minister. We've got all our arguments prepared. I went and presented it. And the minister said, "You've convinced me. I agree the fees are eye-watering and indefensible. But unless you're going to come back with the names of 20 members from my party, the Conservative Party, who agree with you, there's nothing I can do. And it just taught us a really valuable lesson that it's not just, it's not enough to win the argument. You need to win the balance of power as well. And that's kind of the next stage of the campaign. But it was an important lesson to learn, I think, is that the right arguments don't necessarily win the change you want to see. Another example, I think, of what universities are doing, though, that I think is actually quite exciting, is in the sort of meantime, while we're still trying to win that campaign, we're working with King's College London, like Rachel mentioned, which is to set up a sort of payment plan scheme, a loan scheme for young people. So families can apply to it interest-free and get their citizenship at least sorted and then pay back. And that came from, again, not just like designing it in a university office and then pitching it to people, but that came from listening to parents and saying, while we're trying to change the campaign and change the laws, what are the things that would make your lives easier? And then getting the parents to be part of the designing that solution. A lot of parents were saying they would end up borrowing money off family and would create tensions, or taking out payday loans at kind of extortionate interest rates. And actually, by regularizing children's status, it can make the whole family's status in the UK more secure. And so that is now, I think we've had 40 families that have taken out those like interest-free loans so far. And then we're trying to make sure that once families are taking out loans, they're given the option to join the campaign and tackle the systemic causes of that as well. And I think that's something that has been really, really exciting, of genuinely listening to people and putting, the very phrase is people before program. It's like starting with people and then designing programs with them, rather than kind of doing it the other way around, I think, which is always a temptation. So just 2 lessons from our work on that in the last few years.
Thank you, James, for your great insights on what universities are doing that is working well to help further the cause of access to education to precarious status students. And now we're going to go back to Toronto to get their perspective on what educational institutions should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing, as well as if they have any insights as to what, once students are granted access into those spaces, what can these institutions do to increase access, or what areas they need to improve on to ensure that the access is equitable for students without status?
Thank you, Vanessa. So whenever discussing precarious students' issues, there's always a major concern about safety. This concern we refer to as like a double-edged sword. How can we let this segment of the population know there's a pathway to access post-secondary education while guaranteeing their privacy and safety without inviting negative scrutiny? So there are a few practices that can be implemented to provide a safe and inclusive environment for persons of precarious status. The initial stage is policies. Just as the don't ask, don't tell policy was implemented on elementary and secondary level, the Ministry of College and Universities could collaborate with immigration advocates and agencies to ensure access to education on a post-secondary level. Therefore, precarious students are not only able to access these spaces, but are also able to do so safely without disclosing their immigration status. In addition, the university boards should play an active role in ensuring compliance of these policies while also improving on said policies. In Ontario, we are currently under a Conservative government, which causes a pause on provincial advocacy in some aspects. Another step is educational institutions should include training of administrative staff and educators on the issues faced by precarious students and their families. Advocates who are experienced in precarious immigration issues should be the ones developing these training models. Some platforms for training could also include educational campaigns such as the one we're having today. Allyship from advocates and agencies are imperative, as they not only provide support for persons of precarious status, but can also aid in the students in navigating the educational space to ensure their academic success. Allies can also exist in research work on precarious students to shed a more humane light on their unique narratives.
to unmute myself there. Thank you so much for that, Brentella. As my cohort already stated, training does need to happen on campus, but a really big thing that a lot of our members have stated is that they enjoy the sense of anonymity that comes along with being in the program, because a lot of the staff and all of the professors, a lot of the TAs are not really aware of who is in the program, who is, with the overall population of the university. And it allows them a sense of security in which you can access the services that the university provides. You can approach your professors and your TAs without fearing a sense of like apprehension or anything of the sort. So this is something that we would like the post-secondary institutions to take into consideration to provide a sense of safety for the students through anonymity in order to access post-secondary education. A lot of one big factor that we have seen throughout the program in Canada is that a lot of the members don't have access to loans or bursaries. They don't have a lot of economic support, which creates a really weird limbo place because they don't really apply as domestic students and they're not really international students either. So in terms of accessing economic help, they don't really know where to apply. And obviously we cannot access OSAP when we have precarious status, or we are caught in the limbo between waiting for permanent residency, citizenship, etc. And the bursaries are very limited. You have to either wait for somebody to offer the bursary or go through the university's website and check who or what bursary you're eligible for. And this creates like a really weird limbo. You don't really know where to get at economic help. And even though a lot of our students are academically exceeding, this doesn't mean that those who are not or not considered to should not get access to that extra economic help. Everybody should have access to economic help when accessing post-secondary education. So that's one of our major criticisms when it comes to the post-secondary institution as well.
And okay, awesome.
I might just add for context for our non-Toronto audience that a lot of the sort of suggestions and ideas around what needs to change that came from Elizabeth and Brentella are based in the one program in Canada that does exist to allow students to access post-secondary. And so currently York University in Toronto is the only post-secondary institution with a specific program to outright create a pathway for students with precarious status. And we hope to see, and a lot of the work that we do is to push more universities and more colleges to create such programs, but we can talk about that a little bit more later too.
Thank you to our Toronto panelists for sharing with us what the climate is like in Toronto when it comes to accessing post-secondary educations and what it is like inside of educational institutions. So we're going to move on to Kimberly next to get her perspective from the UK about educational institutions, what they should be doing when it comes to loan schemes, training, campus security, peer support, and the like. And also, Kimberly, if you could talk a little bit about how we can build political consensus with different audiences for campaigns to extend the rights of precarious status residents when it comes to access to education, given the current climate that we're in, about how people view immigrants without status.
Thank you, Vanetta. So there are many things. I'm going to speak on this obviously from a UK perspective with regards to all young migrants with precarious status. There are many things that universities in the UK are doing at the moment that are incredible. There is the Universities of Sanctuary now, where universities offer scholarships to young people with complex status. But as you can imagine, these scholarships are oversubscribed, and there is the great need for more because there are thousands of young migrants with complex status in this situation. And many a times it's issues with funding. Perhaps there aren't any, private donors, or there just isn't any money in the pot. And I think that is up to the university. Obviously, they want students who've achieved greatly, students who are willing to contribute, and many young migrants miss out because of that financial element, because they're unable to be eligible for mainstream funding until their status gets resolved. And many of the times the status issues go from a very long period of time. So from the time the young person's 18, looking to go to university, it's almost as if they're placed this burden, and immediately they have to become this adult who's responsible for everything, including their status, of which they themselves have no clear understanding of. So one thing that universities can do is clue themselves up and get training from organisations such as ourselves, We Belong, and other organisations in the sector that do amazing things with regards to just understanding the different entitlements and the different definitions of the immigration statuses of young people with complex status, because there's more than one. And because of that, sometimes there is the issue of some advisors, I guess, understanding one particular stream or group of young migrants more than the other. So we are really campaigning for that inclusivity, and I think universities themselves for sure need to get that training, and not only training, need to open the dialogue between themselves and schools and colleges, because sometimes it's also left to the schools and colleges to help young people prepare. But if the universities made information easily available on their websites, all across their platforms, including, other streams of applying. So in the UK, we've got what's called UCAS, where young people apply to go through to their universities. If there was information on those organisations' websites that would highlight the different entitlements and the different definitions of statuses that young people might find themselves placed in, then they themselves would have an easier understanding of what they're entitled for before they even jump the hurdle of going to university. And not only that, I think higher education institutions need to also recognise the causes, the reasons why young migrants have the particular statuses that they have. And for example, if I can give an example with asylum seekers, their status is also subject to change depending on what they're granted once their case has been solved to the Home Office. And sometimes there isn't that understanding with many higher education institutions. These young people are then blocked from having home fees and instead are classified as international students. However, with that asylum status, they cannot work or do anything else. So one, you're blocked from study, and then you can't do everything else. There just needs to be more of an understanding of the different entitlements and some review into fee classifications, especially for those young migrants that have come to the UK from a very young age. At We Belong, we've got young migrants as young as 2 when they came to the UK. I came when I was 9 years old, and I'm not going to be recognised as a British citizen, full contributor to society until I'm at the age of 30. By then, I've spent, the first 10 years of my working life. But it's incredibly difficult for young migrants, going through just the general life events and stresses that the world brings. And now even more so with COVID and not being able to get your higher education institutions understanding this is the big issue. So I think there's the need to open up that dialogue, and organisations in this sector have worked really, really well through conferences. So I mentioned the Universities of Sanctuary as something that's really important to, I guess, open up the dialogue between universities and, I guess, information experts like myself, and then also bringing forward the views of the young people. Another thing would be a development of services, in particular, like widening participation teams and wellbeing teams. So some universities have widening participation teams whose role is to, I guess, support young migrants who are underrepresented in higher education. So there's many different groups, obviously focusing on this group of young migrants of complex status. I think there is the great need to understand what signs to spot once they have students who have complex status, because there might be ongoing issues in the background that they're not aware of, and that's why certain payments aren't made, or there's that need to get them having that home classification, or there's extra need for further support for referrals to organisations such as ourselves. And many times students are suffering on their own because there's a bit of a disconnect between them and the wellbeing teams at the university, simply because there isn't that wide understanding of the issue. Many people still don't know about it. And again, that, I guess, negative messaging with regards to migrants, which I'll move on to in the next question. And then the last thing I'd say that higher education institutions need to do is have a more vocal stance on the issues that young migrants face, because many a times it's us in terms of the organisations that support young people in this situation, and other activists and all these external parties trying to firefight the situation. But if also higher education providers could provide a more vocal stance to support us and say, you know, this is making their work a lot harder, then it would help things to be streamlined, and maybe more equality to be made in terms of the rules that are made for young people before they go to university. I'm just going to move on to my last point with this question, which is young people's mental health. And that's something that universities have grown so much from, in terms of just being an academic provider. They've also taken on this, I guess, supportive role, providing holistic support for young migrants. But I think more still needs to be done, because there needs to be that understanding of young migrants' identities, and many young migrants growing up British but not British, and not having affordable routes to settlement, and being blocked in so many areas and aspects of their life. It creates, it creates a generation of young people with mixed statuses, but also confusion about their identity and where they fit in society. And for those young migrants that know and face the adverse consequences of, you know, immigration policies, it is really important that universities show that understanding. So whether it's more universities having wellbeing teams or advisors that young people go to often, so it's not just a team of people, it's one person that you speak to every time you need support, that would really help in terms of building up that rapport with young migrants with complex status. And now I'm moving on, sorry for the time, to the next question. I just need to bring it out, which was, how can we build political consensus with different audiences for campaigns to extend the rights of precarious status urban residents to education? So in terms of building that messaging, the really key important thing is to get everybody in the community understanding the issue. So the biggest issue is awareness, and when people don't know what the problem is, you don't get that many people supporting. And obviously with what's in the media, in terms of the good migrant, bad migrant narrative, this is potentially really damaging for young people who are looking to advocate for themselves in terms of this situation. So I think the most important thing is bridging communication with local MPs as well, and not just MPs that the young people, I guess, not have an affiliation with, but not just the MPs in the Labour Party, for example, but also building relationships with MPs in the Conservative Party, and trying to understand politics and trying to open up the dialogue with politics to young people, because sometimes I feel this is something that's quite pushed back, and young people aren't given the opportunities or the space to actually have that understanding to make decisions that affect them, or to understand the law or why certain policies are in place. So in terms of building up young people's capacity, more conversations and open dialogue need to be done between young people and MPs. And not only that, with organisations such as ourselves in civil society, we also need to work more in our messaging, and we continue to push our messages to obviously our supporters, but also to people that don't support us, and trying to, I guess, steer more to just getting that understanding between people. So I think half the time with the public, it's not because that they're against migrants, but it's the picture and the image that's being tainted in the media. So we are a very big promoter of young people sharing their story, but owning their narrative. And we work with young people through, telling their stories through different sessions, different media and different formats. And that I really feel is important, because that's what's at the heart of it, people. And normally you see the statistics, but having faces to those cases certainly really opens up that communication.
Definitely. Thank you, Kimberly, for your many, many insights.
Yeah, I do apologize. I feel like it's one of those things sometimes when you're in a panel, you want to get everything out, but then you don't know if you're talking too much. So I kind of wish there was somebody there to say, stop.
No, you did really well. I really enjoyed hearing you speak. I mean, you have a wealth of information that needs to be shared, and I really appreciate that you could articulate it in such a way. And I definitely agree with you when you spoke about changing the narrative and having young migrants or students with precarious status tell about their stories, have it coming from them. That is a great way to have other people or people who do not have lived experiences to see them in a different way, and to maybe change the way that they view the situation and help build political consensus, right?
Yeah, because it's the different things in our stories, that I find. So it might be that people are connected to the family aspect of your story. We all love our families, or they're connected to the fact that, the resilience of these young migrants, they're still really, keen to further their lives and go on to higher education despite their circumstances. So it's just framing those stories and making sure that they're actually heard.
Definitely. So then we can move away from the danger of a single story of what a migrant is, or what an international student is, or a student without status is. Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. And so we're gonna bring James in and see if he has anything else to add when it comes to building political consensus with different audiences to help extend the rights of precarious status students.
Yeah, thanks. I think just don't have much to add from what Kimberly said, and I think We Belong are probably like the world leaders in some of this work, and I think it's it's really exciting to hear from you, Kimberly, and the work you do. The only thing I think just to reflect on is the role that universities can play in that, and I think coming back to the point I made before, that universities have incredible platforms and a huge range of relationships, and I think if they were to be more kind of intentional about how they use that to kind of to amplify and share some of the stories that Kimberly and We Belong and young people are already putting out there, I think they could go a long way to kind of amplifying their campaigns, giving some like political power and legitimacy to it, but also I think to changing the consensus and reaching a different audience. And I think some of the work I've seen that some universities have done, it takes a bit of courage. Because I have seen some universities have made quite strong statements and got backlash from some of the alumni who perhaps don't share that political view. But the courage that universities can do actually will pay off long term. A lot of universities, just by putting their name on something or putting up some resources behind it, can actually make a massive difference. Just to give a very quick example, there was a youth group of Latin American students in South London who had applied to university and just realized that there was no Latin American box to tick in the ethnicity data. And then wrote to King's, because that was their nearest university, and sort of asked for a meeting about it. And then King's not only just met with them, but talked them through the implications of that. That actually meant that there was no baseline data for Latin Americans in the UK, even though it's one of the fastest growing like ethnic groups. And because there was no baseline data, it meant there was no record of whether they were underrepresented, and so there was no like dedicated programs of outreach or no particular services. And so by listening, they co-created a project to transform the way that outreach is done for the Latin American community, a lot which are disproportionately going to be undocumented or with precarious status. So King's has changed its entire ethnicity document, but then and policies, but then also is now challenging the body that does the census in the UK to try and change that with these young people. And so I think it's just those three particular young women had like incredible ideas and shared their story, wouldn't have had a platform unless King's had amplified that and actually then said, we're going to stand with you. And I think it's just that universities thinking in that way, I think will make an enormous difference.
Thank you for sharing that, James, about something that a university did that helped increase access or improve access. And now we're going to give Tanya the opportunity to also speak to that, to what is working well in the spaces, the universities and the educational institutions that have actually taken on the role of giving precarious status students an opportunity, and what they are doing well, what they are doing that helps increase access, as well as what needs to be improved.
Thanks, Vernetta. And I'm actually happy to follow off James's last point because I'm going to focus on the one university in Canada, as I mentioned before, that is trying to increase access and has created pathways for students with precarious status. So the team at York has worked really hard to try and put different processes in place and make different adjustments in order to facilitate that access. And so I will focus on a couple of things that have worked well. I think there's still a lot of things that need to be thought about and worked on, and I include myself in that process, and hopefully to inspire also other institutions in Ontario and maybe across Canada to think about how they can put some of these processes in place. And so in terms of what's working fairly well, I would say that the application process itself has been working better than maybe expected. I think before programs started, there were a lot of questions about how students with precarious status could even begin to apply to university and what boxes they would tick and how would they potentially get documents that they don't have access to. And so a lot of work has been done around that in order to ensure that there's no immediate, or that there are a few immediate barriers for students, and that the barriers that do exist, that we're able to continue to work to overcome them and or eliminate them. As Liz pointed out earlier, I think that one of the things that we have drawn on, because the program is not overly public and overly advertised, the anonymity of the students allows students with precarious status to just be another student at the university and to sort of attempt to navigate the university as normally as possible. And when that's not possible, to have a support in place, so a support person or an office to help the students overcome whatever barriers. So there's been a lot of thought put into where obstacles might exist, whether that be because of the necessity for certain ID, or for proof of healthcare, proof of a work permit, or any other kind of document that would limit students' ability to study and to participate in the university community. And so having someone to help navigate those questions, to try and eliminate those questions where possible, and to protect the students' anonymity, and having to navigate that, I think has been particularly important to see students through this process. So I think that would look different in different schools and different post-secondary institutions. And I encourage the institutions to think about this for themselves. I also sort of want to highlight what has worked well at York. I think, again, as I'm saying, I think would look very different at another institution, because as actors at other institutions are trying to push for increased status and working with us and working independently to try and create these pathways. I think that's looking very different in very different spaces. And so I am always excited to see the ways that people are being creative to sort of overcome these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, for sharing that. And before we move on, I would like to extend this opportunity to any one of the panelists, any of you, if there was something that you forgot to mention or something that came to mind while hearing the other panelists speak. If you would like to speak to that, you can use this opportunity before we move on.
I think I just wanted to say really quickly, one thing that I'd wanted to add for this was, I guess, effective collaboration with other organizations when it comes to just pushing that access, because sometimes it feels as though there are so many different groups, wherever you are, there's so many different groups fighting towards the same issue, and sometimes that need for collaboration is very important. And we found it's been quite beneficial, and it's actually helped to amplify those voices more, and it's made us stronger, whether it's partnering with another organization that does similar work to We Belong but focuses on one particular group of young migrants. And we also have a stream of different young migrants with different statuses, partnering up with organizations like that. For example, if I give an example, it's better. We basically created an information pack for schools and colleges, and this was to distribute to schools and colleges all across the UK. And we partnered up with another organization called Student Action for Refugees. And they're amazing in terms of campaigning for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers. And we made sure that there was a lot of information, including the different definitions, entitlements, issues that young migrants might face, but not only that, where to get support if there was facing these issues. And we both have advice lines, as well as other organizations in the sector. So linking those organizations as well to that pack was incredibly important and useful. And then we encouraged our own student groups, I guess, to send those to their former schools, as well as us distributing them to local communities as well, sending them to churches, mosques, and other religious institutions to really explain the issue. But I think there's so much power in meaningful collaboration, not just collaborating for the sake of it, but actually finding, I guess, those shared goals or shared mission, if anybody wants to support me with this, and then working together on that, because it's incredibly powerful, and that pack has reached so many young migrants across the UK, and it's invaluable how many young people it's managed to support. And I don't know whether we belong on our own, because we're still a growing organisation. I don't think would have been able to do that, but it does help to have other organisations, although we're fighting different angles, to work together on some of these issues to push things forward. And that's the same when it comes to taking things higher up, or whether it's pressing the government for something. It's good to come together, I guess, with these issues than loads of different organisations screaming different things.
Yes, I got a look at your information package, and it was really comprehensive. I was impressed, and I made a mental note that this is something we in Toronto could also copy and use when it comes to doing our advocacy work as well. So it was very well done.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all. And before we move on, from listening to all the panelists speak about the past few questions, there were a few issues that we all had in common, regardless of whether we were in Toronto or whether we were in the UK. There were issues around access to funding. There was also the safety piece. There was the collaborating with students instead of making decisions and policies without their inclusion, because having the voices heard or hearing the stories is better than doing it independent of them. To that way, when they're included, the policies are more inclusive and it can better help them, especially in terms of mental health and in terms of accessing resources. And so, having said all that, this question goes out to all the panelists. Do you think that there is a role for working at the city level in campaigns when it comes to building political consensus or increasing access to higher education, given that we have so many commonalities when it comes to things that are not working, as well as things that we would like to see that are being done differently?
Maybe I can jump in. So while education is provincially regulated in Ontario, in Canada, and in Ontario, where Toronto is, I think there is a role at the city level, and I think there's work that has been done and can be done at the city level that can be really useful for advancing access to education campaigns. And so for one, we have worked with the city at different moments with city officials and who have been very supportive of access campaigns and access projects. And actually the program at York started with support from the City of Toronto and thinking about the sanctuary city and thinking about, as Brantella explained earlier, the don't ask, don't tell policy at the high school level and the need for students to transition to post-secondary. Different institutions also work with the city in different ways. And I think that is a way of increasing that conversation and that kind of advocacy. I think that post-secondary institutions are also very rooted in, or claim to be very rooted in, the communities where they are based, and express that the importance that has to them, often in their strategic planning and in public statements, and how they want to be representative of the diverse communities in their geographic location. And so I think that's another place where we've been able to sort of push institutions to be more inclusive and to be more accessible to the communities maybe that they're not thinking about, that are in their vicinity, that are part of their community. And finally, I think also at the city level, I think that institutions have different networks and different connections where they meet, where they discuss. I've been invited we've been invited to speak in some of these spaces at times to raise awareness about these issues and push for increased access and what that might look like. So these networks, I think, shouldn't be underestimated in terms of institutions learning from each other and sort of maybe advocating with it amongst each other and pushing each other to be more accessible and be more equitable and offer more equitable education to the diverse populations. What we did see was when one university, as I was saying before, when one university, York University, started the program, other institutions got very curious and sort of started asking questions about how that could be done and how it was being done. And so those questions haven't led to new programs yet, but I think these are spaces where we could push harder, and we hope to push harder to increase access.
Thank you, Tanya, for sharing the Toronto perspective. And we're going to go to James next for the UK perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a quite a big opportunity at city level. Partly, I talked a lot about universities kind of utilizing their power, and actually, I think just structurally in the UK tends to be that it's quite hard at the moment to make national change on kind of issue regarding young migrants, just because of the demographic shift, and we've got a conservative government with a large majority. But at city level, actually, universities can have quite a big impact if it's just tens of thousands of potential voters, a lot of resource and influence. And I put in an example in the chat where We Belong and our London branch, London Citizens, worked together in the last mayoral election cycle to create a deputy mayor for social integration. That's actually done quite a few since I've been in post. There was created like quite a few really kind of pushed the agenda on in London quite a lot and put a lot of resource and political capital into some of these campaigns. And we're doing the same. We've got a mayoral election in 6 months' time in London as well. And we're doing the same, and this time asking for investment in legal advice in schools. So I think there's loads that can be done in cities that perhaps is easier to create change, definitely in the UK context, than it would be nationally. The challenge we have is that compared to other cities around the world, in the UK, the powers aren't devolved that much. There's a limited remit of what mayors can do. But one thing I think that is really exciting, and I think would be good for us to think about, is basically for cities to learn from each other, and basically take on best practice and try and sort of take it a bit further and do that likewise. And I'm often asking Rachel like what's happening in Toronto and if we can learn from it, and other cities. And I think that's something that could be internationally really valuable, which is sort of to take innovative work that's happening in other cities and then push for it in our own cities. And universities could be the perfect vehicle and site for doing that.
Thank you, James, for sharing, and Tanya as well. And in the interest of time, we are now at 1:13. We're gonna go to Rachel to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Hi, thanks so much, Vanessa, and to you all for such a fascinating and rich conversation. There's so much to learn and so much to learn from each other, and so many overlaps. I'm sure this is just the beginning of some great collaborations. There is a question in the chat from Megan, which is to everyone. And she asks, how are approaches to activism going to adapt and the impact of the coronavirus? So if anyone wants to think about or reflect on your work and how it's been affected by the coronavirus. If anyone wants to jump in, Kimberly?
Yeah, I was going to say our work was heavily affected by the virus. I think just mainly, I'd say my role in particular, just because it involves actual direct contact and meeting young people. We're normally used to having young people come to our office and speak to us regarding situations. Obviously, that's not possible. But also we do group gatherings, so monthly meetings with young people. So I think that importance of community that I was explaining earlier, that, you know, that feeling, we don't want them to have that feeling that they're going through this alone. So we try and raise up, I guess, the contact that we have with them from one-to-one meetings with myself, on particular issues that they might be facing that they would have come to us for, whether it's immigration or education, and then also one-to-ones with regards to their well-being, and just monitoring that every single month to make sure they're okay, even after the problem is gone, just making sure that that carries through. It's been very difficult not to have that human contact, and I think many young migrants have also suffered if they've had parents who are either in health and social care and haven't been able to continue working, or they've lost their jobs, or again finances in general have been fairly tight, and also having to deal with increasingly staggering fees for citizenship, or to renew their visas to maintain their residency. It's been really, really hard. We had a COVID emergency grant that was running for a while, and I know some organisations also had something similar. But I think that was really, really beneficial for a lot of people making those Home Office applications, visa applications, because the money was just nowhere to be found. And many of our young people, being students who have 0-hour contract type of employment, that again was incredibly difficult in areas such as hospitality, where you're facing a long break now without earning anything. So those, I think those have been the biggest challenges financially and mentally, in terms of just that mental aspect of not only dealing with issues with the Home Office, it's now being unable to get into university, or facing issues with student finance, who are the loan lending company for mainstream funds in the UK, and not being able to reach through them, whether it's because of COVID lines and phone lines aren't being answered all the time, or you're speaking to one person, or another day someone else is unavailable, not being able to contact your lawyer. It's all those different things that COVID has really brought and shone a light on. But we've been navigating through this by moving a lot of our efforts online. So the one-to-one meetings I was speaking about still do continue on Zoom like this, obviously shorter, because not everybody likes to spend long periods of time on a computer. But also signposting young people to organisations that were offering free laptops, because not all young people have, not all of our young people with complex status have access, to internet laptops. So it's been a long road, but that's some of the stuff that we've been doing to combat the issue. And in terms of moving our work online, it's also training that being moved online with school staff, and that's actually worked pretty well. Learning, once you figure out Zoom and everything else, and making things concise and a lot more interactive, like this session, we've managed to navigate through that. And just boosting that sort of social media engagement as well. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested. Oh, sorry. I just want to follow up on something. Sorry, Tanya, I think you're about to jump in. Because it sounds like that obviously COVID is unsettling and affecting everyone, albeit different people are affected differently. And it sounds like it's also opened up some avenues or some spaces where you can provide a different kind of support. And I also wonder whether that's also linked to the kind of narratives or campaigns. Have you seen that there's been an opening in some areas that you've also been able to draw on, or has that not really played out?
I guess when you say has it opened up areas, do you mean more than just the access to higher education?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of people kind of thinking about society differently because of coronavirus, and different sorts of campaigns that have kind of been pushed forward, and they have their opportunities and also their challenges, because they're also based on particular kinds of moral hierarchies around deservingness, for example, or particular kinds of students, like only very high achieving academic students. So creating this kind of,
isn't it?
good migrant, bad migrant dichotomy. Yeah. And so I just wondered if you had experienced that and how you deal with that really as an organization.
I think we've been fortunate enough, I think, to have so many supporters just pushing the agenda and the message. What we try to do is just make sure we actually provide clear messaging, because sometimes I mentioned that we've got 3 different projects going on. So the equal access to higher education, as well as the chasing status. And there are many times where, we're fighting for those different campaigns, and sometimes the messaging can get lost. And one thing that we've actually figured during COVID is that when we are posting things about a particular campaign, it's to solely stick to the messaging of that, and then on a different week or a different day, stick to the messaging of one, because it can get lost in translation. People are getting so much information fed through to them during this time. And I know we're spending more time on our phones, which is great, because then people get to see and raise awareness more. But then there's so much information. Sometimes it's just quite hard to digest. So making things more accessible as well. So not only are we doing those reports, we're now doing videos, there's podcasts with young people having these open conversations and dialogues. And I'm hoping, going into 2021, we can have MPs come on there and have an open conversation with young people, have a podcast, and keep these conversations going, not just through blogs, but also through podcasting, through YouTube, through everything really. And then the last thing, sorry, I'm taking so much time, but I'm so passionate about this issue. well, the last thing that I wanted to speak about was the fact that COVID has been, I don't know, it's not been a blessing at all. But one thing that COVID has allowed us is to span our remit in terms of working with young people all across the UK. So now we've got, young people in Scotland joining our gatherings, because before these gatherings were in person. So it's definitely allowed more groups of young people and more connections to be made all across the UK, especially in those particular areas where there might not be that many migrants or migrant community. There's some areas in the UK where you've got a larger group of young migrants, and some that you don't have many at all. So that sense of community online has been really, really important. I'll go now.
Thank you so much. Vanetta, do you have something that you want to add?
No, I think Tanya wanted to say something, so let's give Tanya this opportunity.
I'm so inspired by Kimberly, and I want to pick up on so many of the things that she talked about that made me reflect on things that we're doing and the way that we're working. I think it's been so important, especially during COVID, to stay connected and to figure out how to stay connected. And I think for us, it has actually presented some opportunities, because us 4 members are coming from so far apart in the city of Toronto and outside the city of Toronto even, that connecting over Zoom reduces transportation time, and in some ways makes it a little bit easier to connect. And so we've had a larger group from week to week than we maybe did when we were in person, and we've found ways to discuss things in a different way. And we've been running workshops each week to educate each other about different topics, which has been so interesting and team building in a way, and has made for such rich discussions and such a great group. I also am thinking about what Kimberly said earlier about the importance of connecting to other groups and the importance of building larger movements that way. And we are connected to some other migrant justice groups in Toronto and across Canada. And COVID has really been a moment where, in Canada at least, the discussion around status for all and the need for everyone who's here with a precarious status to have a permanent status really has come to light because of the precarity that COVID has put on people, and the different ways that people have suffered because of COVID as it intersects with their precarious status. So it's really been an opportunity to talk about a massive regularization or status for all campaign in a new way that has been kind of exciting despite the sort of challenges associated with it. So the new connections and the importance of those connections, I think, have been really clear throughout this time. Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think we are at the end of our session here today. Thank you to our panel, all our panelists. You have been great. Thank you for a very generative, timely, and passionate conversation about what should come next for sanctuary students when it comes to our approach to make accessible and equitable post-secondary education. Thank you to all our viewers, all of you who joined our webinar to listen to us. And I know you're here because you are interested in the cause, and I hope that you can take some of the information that was shared with you today to help further that cause. Rachel, I don't know if you have something else to say before we sign off.
Just to echo that, thank you all so much for this really rich conversation. We will be sharing the link to this recording and collecting all of the links that you've shared in the chat, and I may be badgering you as well for other links and resources so that we can compile that and share it with everyone, and also be building on these conversations in the future. I don't know whether Graham wants to come in and add anything before we close. Graham, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I've got my kids in the background, so it's probably a good thing. I just want to echo the sentiment. This has been just an incredible panel, incredible set of series. I've been motivated and inspired. And one thing just to note, Rachel and I had seen in the participants window, there were a couple of representatives from cities, like in Toronto, city staff. And one thing to note that none of the panels had a representative from municipalities. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that was because so often there's a kind of a conflation between sanctuary city and municipal policies, and we wanted to avoid centering government and the state and their interests. But at the same time, there was such a number of opportunities for really important dialogue between practitioners and service providers and city staff. And we hope in the future that we can kind of generate some more collaborative discussions with policymakers at the local level, provincial, state levels, national level, and global levels. So for those of you who are watching who are from cities, thank you for being here, and please reach out. We'd like to keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Graham. And thank you all. Vanetta, you have the last word, please.
Thank you. In that case, I would just like to leave us with one quote that I like very much. It's when you educate one person, you change a life. When you educate many, you can change the world. Thank you.
That was lovely. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna go. See you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.